When Officer Marcus Reed finds a trembling young girl huddled alone on a desolate park bench during a bitter, moonless night, his gut tells him something isn't right. At first, it seems like a simple case of a lost child, until her tearful eyes and haunted expressions stir painful memories of his long-missing daughter, Emma. Before we dive into this tale of heartache, mystery, and unwavering determination in the name of justice, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in the power of truth, hit that like button and subscribe for more. The air was viciously cold the night Officer Marcus Reed first encountered the trembling girl on the park bench. He had been driving his usual patrol route along the winding roads that skirted the local community park. It was routine for him to cruise through that area, shining the squad car's headlights between the tall, skeletal trees whose barren branches rattled under a steady, icy wind. At this late hour, the park was always deserted. Few people dared wander out here when the temperature dropped so low that the frost clung to every blade of grass like crystal shards. The hush of that winter darkness often mingled with the constant hum of his own memories, especially memories of a child who had once been the center of his entire world. He couldn't help it. Every lonely place at night reminded him of Emma, the daughter taken from him 8 years ago. He was near the old metal benches that lined the park's lone paved path when he spotted a silhouette huddled at the far edge of one bench. At first, he thought it might be a large bag of trash or discarded clothing. Something about its slight movement caught his attention, though, prompting him to slow down and direct the cruiser's lights more precisely. That was when he saw her. A little girl with blonde hair peeking out from under a hood, arms wrapped around her knees as though she were trying to fold into herself and disappear from the world. The breath caught in his throat, an immediate and intuitive alarm going off in his mind. Children did not sit alone in parks at this hour unless something was terribly wrong. He pulled up, killed the engine, and stepped out into the frigid air. The wind sliced across his face, but the greater jolt he felt was emotional. The last time he had encountered a lost child, truly lost or in danger, was that fateful night when his own daughter had vanished. He remembered how he had torn through every corner of the neighborhood, calling Emma's name, imagining she might simply have wandered off and become frightened. Of course, the truth was so much worse. She was never found, and over the years, the nightmares never ceased. Now, with his heart hammering, he approached the figure on the bench as carefully as he could, wanting to avoid scaring the girl any further. He spoke in a low, gentle voice. "Hey there, it's okay. I'm Officer Marcus Reed. You need help?" The child looked up, eyes showing stark, naked fear. She was so pale that her lips looked almost bluish from the cold. Closer now, he realized she couldn't be older than 9, maybe 10 at most, though something about her size suggested she might be on the younger side. Her hair was tangled, cheeks flushed from the biting wind, and she wore a coat that looked several sizes too big. She stared at him without speaking. He could see the tension in her posture, as though she was deciding whether to bolt. He took a step closer, arms slightly raised to show he meant no harm. "You're safe," he said. "It's too cold to be out here alone. Can you tell me your name?" He watched her eyes dart left and right, scanning the darkness behind the benches, behind the skeletal silhouettes of trees. Finally, in a voice so faint it nearly vanished into the wind, she said, "Zoe." His chest tightened with relief that she spoke at all. "Zoe," he repeated gently, "do you have somewhere you're supposed to be? A mom or dad I can call?" At that, tears brimmed in her eyes, and she shook her head, hugging her knees tighter. "Okay," he murmured, "I understand. Let's get you somewhere warm, all right? You're freezing." He cautiously reached out a hand. She stared at it for several seconds, and then very slowly, she gave the slightest nod and unfolded herself from the bench. Her small hand was icy cold as he helped her stand. "You must be so cold," he said again, removing his own heavy jacket and draping it over her shoulders. It nearly swallowed her, but at least she would gain some warmth. Then he guided her toward the squad car, opening the passenger door for her. She climbed inside in silence, tension evident in the stiffness of her posture. He drove to the local police station, casting careful glances at her from time to time. He tried some gentle conversation, but each time he asked a question about where she came from, who she might have been with, she froze up or whispered, "I don't know," in a tiny voice. Marcus didn't press too hard, mindful that she was deeply frightened and that trust would take time. Still, he couldn't quell the sense of urgency taking shape in his chest. This child, so lost and vulnerable in the bitter cold, stirred something in him that he had buried for years, a protectiveness he used to feel with Emma, a fierce paternal need to make the world safe for a little one who had no defenses of her own. When they arrived at the station, an unremarkable building with institutional lighting and a wide parking lot, he took Zoe inside, where the overnight desk officer, Harriet, immediately noticed the situation. Harriet was an older woman with a warm heart and a habit of fussing over every stray or lost soul who came through those doors. She gave the girl a motherly smile, reached under the desk, and produced a heavy blanket used for emergencies. "Officer Reed found you in the park?" Harriet asked, draping the blanket over Zoe's shoulders. Zoe nodded, eyes wide but hesitant. Harriet caught Marcus's serious expression and turned her attention to the computer in front of her. "I'll check to see if we have any current missing child reports matching her description," she said. "In the meantime, maybe get her something hot to drink." Marcus agreed and led Zoe to a small break room down a corridor where harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The station was quiet at this hour, with only a skeleton crew on duty. The break room held a battered table, a few chairs, a vending machine, and a coffee pot that was likely a few hours old. Still, there was a kettle for hot water and some cocoa mix stored nearby. Marcus put water on to boil, then looked over at Zoe. "You all right?" he asked gently. She was standing near the door, eyes flicking around the room as though she expected someone to jump out at her. Even in the relative safety of the station, she seemed to shrink into herself. "Hey, it's okay," he said, trying to soften his expression, mindful that she had no reason to trust him yet. She nodded shakily, not saying anything. He could sense her fear and confusion, the way she trembled, not just from the cold but from whatever horrors she had fled. He poured hot water into a paper cup, added cocoa mix, stirred, and then blew on it to cool it down. Handing it to her, he gave a little smile. "Careful, it's hot," he said, recalling the many times he had made hot chocolate for Emma on chilly nights. That memory squeezed his heart. Zoe clutched the cup. Her hands shook slightly, making the liquid wobble, but she took a small sip. The warmth seemed to bring a bit of relief. She sighed softly, tears lingering at the corners of her eyes. Marcus watched her, concern mixing with a heavy sadness he carried everywhere. "Do you remember anything about why you were in the park?" he asked. "Were you trying to run away from something?" She opened her mouth, and for a moment it looked like she would speak, but then she shook her head, tears threatening to spill. "I can't say," she whispered. "They'll get mad." His skin prickled. "They? Who's they?" Again she remained mute, hugging the styrofoam cup as if it were her only lifeline. He recognized the signs of a deeply terrified child, one who might have been warned or threatened into silence. He managed to get her to the precinct's small lounge area for vulnerable minors. It wasn't much, just a room with a cot, some toys, a child-sized table and chairs. At least it was warmer than the park. Harriet joined them, fussing over Zoe. "Honey, do you know your last name? Do you have any family around here?" Zoe shook her head, and Harriet met Marcus's eyes with a look that said, "This might take a while." She gathered some coloring books from a nearby cupboard, trying to coax Zoe to sit at the table. "Why not color for a bit?" Harriet suggested. "That's always nice." Zoe glanced at the crayons and paper but seemed too overwhelmed to do much. Marcus lingered in the doorway. He was torn. One part of him wanted to cradle this little girl, keep her safe forever, because the paternal side of him ached with all the longing and regret he'd harbored since Emma was taken. Another part of him, the seasoned police officer, wanted to push for answers, to figure out who had done this to her, or how she ended up in that freezing park. But he knew to go slowly. He had learned, through painful mistakes, that traumatized children needed gentleness above all. So he waited, watched, and tried to be patient. An hour later, Harriet poked her head out of the lounge to speak quietly with Marcus. She had found no immediate matches in the missing children database with the name Zoe matching this girl's approximate age and description. She could have come from out of state, Harriet said. Or the name itself might be made up. We can't be sure. Marcus nodded. We'll have to place her in protective care until we find out more. She clearly doesn't want to be found by whoever she was with before. He realized, with a pang, how quickly an underfunded system could lose track of a child like Zoe. If her abductors or abusers had the right connections, they might slip right back in to claim her. The mere thought of it made him tense with anger and fear on her behalf. He was still lost in these thoughts when the doors at the front of the station swung open and a couple stormed inside. The man was tall, neatly groomed, wearing a worried expression that morphed quickly into impatience. The woman by his side clutched a handbag and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, as though crying. They spoke loudly to Harriet, saying they were looking for a missing child, a girl they'd adopted recently, named Zoe. Harriet, eyebrows raised, glanced over to Marcus, and he knew in a flash that these must be the mysterious parents. Marcus asked Harriet to hold them in the waiting area while he stepped out of the lounge, closing the door gently so Zoe wouldn't be alarmed. He approached the couple, scanning them quickly. The woman, Patricia, she said, immediately launched into a tearful monologue. We've been searching everywhere for her. She's had such a hard time adjusting, and we were so worried. Thank God you found her. Please, can we see her right away? Her words poured out with a forced, emotional tremor in her voice. Marcus listened, remaining neutral. I found her alone in the park, he said evenly. She was terrified and cold. Do you have any identification or proof of guardianship or adoption? The man, Alan, looked offended. Of course, he snapped. This is ridiculous. She's our daughter, our adoptive daughter. We have documents. He pulled out some paperwork, which at first glance looked somewhat official, but all were photocopies. Marcus flipped through them, noticing that the details about the adoption date and location were inconsistent. He remembered plenty of forged adoption documents from past investigations, and these set off alarm bells in his mind. He handed the documents back. Where did you adopt her from? He asked in a calm, policeman's tone. Patricia launched into a story about a private adoption agency. But the more she talked, the more Marcus noticed contradictory statements. She first mentioned they had lived in a certain neighborhood, then corrected herself and said it was a different city. Alan's stiff posture and occasional glances toward the exit further fueled Marcus's suspicion. It's late, and Zoe is very shaken, Marcus said, guarding his tone carefully. For her safety, we're going to keep her here until we verify that everything is in order. Please understand, we have to follow proper procedure. Patricia's eyes flashed with anger before she reassembled her weepy demeanor. But we're her parents, she insisted. We just want to take her home. Marcus remained polite but resolute. I understand you're concerned, but she told us she was afraid to go back. We have to protect her. Alan's face darkened, and Marcus watched the man curl his hands into fists. That told him all he needed to know about how well Zoe might be treated under their care. He signaled Harriet to show them out, explaining that they'd be contacted once everything had been properly investigated. The couple left, but not without a final glare of frustration. Patricia's last words, tossed over her shoulder, were, "We'll be back with our lawyer." Marcus felt a flicker of grim satisfaction as they walked away. He wouldn't let that girl out of his sight until he was certain of what was going on. When he went back to the lounge, he saw Zoe sitting in the corner, hugging her knees, tears leaking down her cheeks. Harriet was crouched beside her, trying to comfort her, but Zoe looked inconsolable. Marcus asked Harriet for a moment alone with the girl, then knelt beside her. "Zoe," he said softly, Were those the people you ran away from? She nodded, trembling. Please don't make me go with them, she whispered. They said if I ever told anyone, they'd hurt me. They're not nice. I don't want to go back. Marcus's heart broke a little. He put a gentle hand on her shoulder. I promise you, I won't let them hurt you, he said. I'm going to do everything I can to protect you, okay? The haunted look she gave him was full of fragile hope, the sort of hope he had seen in other victims' eyes over the years. But this girl was only 9, or thereabouts. She shouldn't have been forced to carry such fear at such a tender age. That night, the station arranged for Zoe to sleep in a safe room. Harriet stood watch, checking in on her every hour. Marcus, unable to rest, sat at his desk, flipping through reams of old records, searching for any known patterns of trafficked children or suspicious adoptions. Every so often, he found himself staring at the photograph that always lived on his desk, Emma, when she was just a year old, perched on his lap, her tiny hands gripping at the edges of his police badge. The memory of his lost daughter mingled uncomfortably with the reality of Zoe, this frightened child who reminded him so painfully of what it felt like to fail to protect someone small and precious. He made a vow to himself, right then and there, that he wouldn't fail Zoe, no matter the cost. The next day brought more complications. Patricia and Alan turned up again, this time with flimsy new paperwork that looked suspiciously similar to the old ones, only with different stamps or signatures that they claimed were more official. They grew confrontational when Harriet insisted they couldn't see Zoe yet. Marcus confronted them in the lobby, explaining that until the authenticity of their documents could be verified by the appropriate agencies, Zoe would remain under protective care. Alan's lips were pressed into a thin line, and Patricia, though trying to act distraught, showed flickers of anger that undermined her motherly facade. By midday, Marcus sat down with Zoe in a quieter moment. He handed her a small cup of hot chocolate. Zoe, he began gently, can you tell me anything about how you ended up with Alan and Patricia? Even small details could help us figure out what's really going on. The girl fidgeted with the cup. She wouldn't look him in the eye at first, as if she was ashamed or afraid. Eventually, in halting, whispered words, she told him about being in a place with other children. She couldn't remember its name or location. She only knew that one day, she was taken away to live with Alan and Patricia. She said she wasn't allowed to go outside much, that she sometimes had to meet friends of Alan and Patricia, adults who seemed very interested in her and the other kids. That detail made Marcus's blood run cold. It sounded disturbingly like a trafficking ring, or at the very least, an abusive adoption racket. Zoe's eyes welled with tears as she recalled forced pictures, fancy clothing, and stern warnings not to speak. They'd yell if I asked questions, she said. Sometimes they'd lock me in my room if I didn't do what they said. Marcus, fighting a rising wave of anger, gently thanked her for telling him what she could. No one will hurt you anymore, he said, though in his heart he knew how fragile that promise could be if higher-ups or the legal system failed to keep her out of Alan and Patricia's clutches. As the day wore on, his longtime colleague, Detective Laura da Silva, caught wind of the situation and offered her help. Laura had been one of the few on the force who had truly empathized with Marcus after Emma's abduction, quietly assisting in any leads that Marcus pursued on his own time. She had connections in child welfare agencies and offered to dig into Alan and Patricia's backgrounds, combing through out-of-state adoption records, possible aliases, and financial data. Marcus felt relief at having a dedicated ally on board. The more he heard of Zoe's story, the more convinced he became that this was no mere case of a troubled foster arrangement. Something bigger, more sinister, was lurking beneath the surface. It didn't take long for Laura to turn up red flags. Alan and Patricia don't have a clear history beyond 18 months ago, she reported, tapping a stack of printouts she had compiled. It's as though they arrived out of nowhere. Their finances involve large transfers from offshore accounts, which is obviously not typical if they're supposed to be an average middle-class couple adopting a child. Marcus felt a surge of anger laced with a dark excitement. If these suspicious financial records connected to a known ring or even a single known trafficker, they might have a starting point to request a more thorough investigation, perhaps even a search warrant. But for that, they would need more direct evidence. Zoe's statements were powerful, but she was a child, and forging adoption papers didn't automatically prove a larger crime ring. They needed a smoking gun, indisputable documents, or multiple witnesses, or something that would link Alan and Patricia to criminal activity beyond a shadow of a doubt. His concern was that Zoe would be forced to return to them if the station couldn't justify holding her. Indeed, his captain grew uneasy with every passing day that Zoe remained at the station. "Look," his captain told him in a tense meeting, "I'm all for protecting the kid, but if these people produce real proof and the social services folks can't definitively prove abuse, we might have to give her back. We can't hold her indefinitely on suspicion alone." Marcus argued passionately, "Zoe has made serious allegations of abuse. We have multiple inconsistencies in the couple's paperwork. Let's at least wait until we can verify everything. That child's life could be in danger if we release her prematurely." The captain relented to some extent, granting Marcus more time, but it was clear that the clock was ticking. If they couldn't secure a solid legal foundation soon, the couple's lawyers might force the issue. On top of that mounting pressure, Marcus began receiving anonymous threats. The first was a phone call in the early morning, just before dawn, from an unknown number. A gravelly voice said, "Return the girl to her rightful guardians or you'll regret it," then hung up. The second was a typed note slipped under his apartment door warning him to drop his investigation. He showed these to Laura and Harriet, but all it did was confirm that powerful forces were determined to muzzle him. Marcus's only response was a surge of renewed determination. He had lost one daughter to an unknown criminal years ago. He wasn't about to lose another vulnerable child who had come under his protection. Late one afternoon, Harriet told him that Zoe had finally revealed a key piece of information, an old address she remembered from when Alan and Patricia first took her in. She said it was a rundown house in a different town, Harriet explained. She didn't know the street name, but she remembered the number on the door and that the house had broken steps out front. She also mentioned that other kids used to come through there. Marcus leapt on this lead. He drove out with Laura, heading to the neighboring city in search of a property that matched the rough description. After a few hours of investigating, they found it, a row house with broken front steps, seemingly abandoned. A neighbor confirmed that a couple matching Alan and Patricia's description had lived there recently, along with various children who appeared and disappeared at odd hours. Marcus's blood boiled. Yet without a valid warrant or direct cause, he couldn't break into the abandoned property just on suspicion. So he and Laura documented everything, took photos, and swore to tie it back to the couple so they could present it to a judge. Days passed, and as they delved deeper, the puzzle pieces started to align. Suspicious offshore money, a pattern of addresses used briefly and then abandoned, and Zoe's recollections of multiple children passing through. It smelled like a child trafficking ring disguised under the veneer of private adoptions. Marcus and Laura even uncovered older cases where families claimed they had engaged in overseas adoptions only to find out the child's records had been falsified. A handful of these cases mentioned a specific network, never fully dismantled, that specialized in providing new, fictitious identities to missing children. The more Marcus discovered, the more nights he spent haunted by insomnia. He recognized that this ring might very well be the same kind that had stolen Emma, although he hadn't allowed himself to voice that thought yet. It seemed too painful, too impossible. Yet there was a stirring in his heart that made him think of Emma every time he looked at Zoe. They were about the same age. Zoe was 9. Emma would have been 9, nearly 10. Was it possible? He told himself it was a coincidence, but the idea kept pulsing in his mind, refusing to be dismissed. He quietly arranged a DNA test, something Harriet and Laura helped him do without raising eyebrows. They took a swab from Zoe's cheek one morning under the guise of official protocol to confirm her identity. Marcus provided his own sample, labeling it as a simple cross-reference needed for the system. Then he sent it off to a private lab he trusted, paying extra for expedited results. He told no one else, not even his captain, for fear the information might leak and put Zoe at greater risk. If, by some miraculous chance, Zoe turned out to be Emma, he knew that would change everything, not just for the case but for his entire life. In the interim, the couple's lawyer bombarded the station with demands and threats of lawsuits. They insisted Zoe was their legal daughter, that the police had unlawfully detained her. Harriet caught wind that some members of the city council were pressuring the department to avoid controversy. The tension in the station rose as more officials poked their noses in, questioning whether it was worth the trouble to fight a presumably well-funded family's claim on a child. Marcus refused to yield. He had seen Zoe's terror, heard her stories of abuse. Even if his fatherly instincts weren't screaming at him to protect her, he would never abide letting an abused child slip back into darkness. Finally, the DNA results arrived. It was late at night, and the station was mostly empty except for Harriet at the front desk and a few patrol officers out on calls. Laura found the envelope on Marcus's desk, unopened. She knocked softly on his office door, stepping inside with a solemn expression, handing him the results. Marcus's hand shook as he tore the envelope open. His eyes skimmed the words once, then again, until they no longer swam in front of him. He felt as if the room was spinning. A probability of paternity, 99.98%. The words stared up at him from the page. Zoe was Emma. Emma Reed, the daughter who had been taken from him 8 agonizing years ago, was in the next room, lost and frightened and wanting nothing more than to be safe. He read the test result over and over, tears filling his eyes. He had dreamed of this moment for so long, yet never believed it could actually come true. A raging storm of emotions broke inside him: elation, grief for all the lost years, fury at the monsters who had taken her, and an almost unbearable love that swelled inside his chest until he thought he might cry out. Laura, her own eyes wet, placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Marcus, she's Emma. What are you going to do?" He wiped at his tears, taking a moment to breathe. His first instinct was to run to the lounge where Zoe, Emma, was resting, scoop her into his arms, and tell her everything. But he knew he had to be strategic. She was traumatized, barely beginning to trust him. Revealing this seismic truth might be overwhelming if not handled gently. Plus, if word got out prematurely that she was actually his daughter, the criminals behind this entire operation might make a desperate move, or some powerful ally of theirs might try to snatch her away to cover their tracks. He murmured, "We have to proceed carefully. But I won't keep this from her. She deserves to know. And we need to make sure we have enough evidence to lock away Alan, Patricia, and everyone else involved in this ring. Otherwise, Emma, Zoe, won't be safe." Laura nodded, voice trembling. "I understand. I'll help you. We'll bring this to the captain as soon as we have the rest of the evidence we need to charge them with kidnapping. We can't risk them escaping on a technicality." Marcus spent the next hour battling his emotions, pacing his office, staring at the DNA results over and over. At last, he walked slowly to the room where Zoe, his daughter, was sitting on a cot, Harriet reading a storybook to her in a soothing tone. He cleared his throat, and Harriet gave him a gentle, knowing nod, then excused herself, leaving him alone with the girl. Emma looked up at him, the same wide eyes that had once peered from a crib so many years ago. Her hair was lighter now, her features more mature, but in that moment he recognized her all over again. He sat beside her on the edge of the cot. His words came slowly, thick with suppressed emotion. "Zoe, I have something important to tell you." She tensed a little, hugging a small stuffed bear Harriet had given her. Marcus could barely contain the surge in his chest. "I've been doing everything I can to figure out who you are, where you came from. I've discovered that you were taken from your real family when you were very young. Do you remember anything about living somewhere else, maybe a long time ago?" She blinked, tears forming. I get dreams. I see a backyard and a swing set. There's a man who picks me up and puts me on his shoulders, and a lady with pretty hair. But I always thought it was just a dream. She sniffled. They told me I never had a family before them, so I guess I believed it. Marcus exhaled, tears threatening to fall. That wasn't just a dream. That was your real life. His voice broke. You have a dad who's been searching for you for a very long time. He never gave up, never stopped hoping to find you. She looked at him quizzically, as if not daring to believe. His hands trembled as he placed his palm gently over hers. Zoe, you're my daughter. Your real name is Emma Reed. I'm your father. Her entire body jerked in surprise, eyes going wide. She gazed at him for a long moment, the silence charged. But how? She managed in a faint whisper, tears glistening. I don't remember much. Marcus squeezed her hand gently. We did a DNA test that proved it. When you were very small, someone took you from our home. I've been looking for you ever since. I know it's a lot to take in. He paused, voice quivering with emotion. I just want you to know that you're safe now. No matter what happens, I'm not letting you go. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Her breathing hitched. You're my dad? The word Dad rolled off her tongue like something both foreign and familiar. Slowly, as though unsure, she leaned forward. Marcus opened his arms, and she pressed herself against him. He enveloped her in a hug that felt like it spanned all the missing years, all the lonely moments he had spent imagining this exact reunion. She sobbed into his chest, and he stroked her hair, tears dripping onto the top of her head. It was overwhelming. Joy, grief, relief, all coiling into a single moment of love rediscovered. When Harriet looked in on them later, she saw Emma curled up against Marcus, both of them quietly crying. Harriet, eyes misty, stepped away so as not to intrude, deeply moved by the sight of a father and daughter finding each other after so long. Later, Laura also approached, noticing the pair, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. Now it wasn't just a matter of saving an anonymous child from abusers, it was about reuniting a family that had been shattered by a cruel act. She resolved to do whatever it took to keep Emma safe and bring those criminals to justice. Marcus spent the night at the station, not wanting to leave Emma's side. In between comforting her, he coordinated with Laura on the next steps. They had enough suspicious evidence to bring to a judge, but they needed one final piece that would definitively link Alan and Patricia to the larger ring. If they could secure that link, they could move in for arrests, search warrants, the works. The biggest risk was that if the criminals realized Emma was identified and that Marcus was her father, they might disappear or lash out violently. That chance arrived in the form of an old case file referencing a woman named Sylvia Rosewood, who had once tried to blow the whistle on an adoption scam before vanishing under suspicious circumstances. Laura discovered a note in the department's archives suggesting Sylvia had left behind a ledger detailing transactions for illegal adoptions. Marcus and Laura tracked down Sylvia's surviving sister, an older woman named Eloise, who lived in a remote farmhouse. Reluctantly, Eloise handed over a sealed envelope that Sylvia had entrusted to her shortly before she disappeared. Inside was a USB flash drive and typed documents describing an extensive network of falsified adoptions, forged birth certificates, and large payoffs to intermediaries. The name Alan Carver appeared, and cross-referencing showed that Alan Carver was one of the aliases used by the man they knew as Alan. Patricia was also listed, alongside references to offshore accounts. Everything lined up in horrifying detail, confirming that children were indeed being trafficked and rebranded with fake identities. They wasted no time presenting this to a local judge known for integrity. With this smoking gun, the judge signed off on search warrants for Alan and Patricia's current residence and for multiple other properties identified in the ledger. Marcus's heart hammered as the operation came together. A joint task force, along with federal agents, prepared to strike. He felt a swirl of anticipation and dread. If they succeeded, Emma would be safe forever, and maybe other children could be rescued. If they failed, or if the criminals slipped away, the consequences could be dire. On the evening of the raid, Marcus made sure Emma was in a secure location at the station with Harriet guarding her. He geared up with body armor, holstered his weapon, and joined the team outside Alan and Patricia's suburban house. The neighborhood looked peaceful under the soft glow of streetlights. Most neighbors were probably inside, watching TV, with no idea that a massive sting operation was about to unfold on their block. The officers approached quietly, flashlights cutting through the dusk. Then, on the signal, they moved in, battering ram cracking the front door. Shouts of, "Police, warrant," filled the air. Marcus was among the first inside, adrenaline surging. Alan came rushing from an upstairs room, eyes wild with anger and fear. Patricia screamed, demanding to know where Zoe, Emma was. Marcus leveled his gun, voice echoing with all the fury he had suppressed. "You have the right to remain silent. We know you kidnapped her. We know what you've been doing." Alan tried to lash out, but was quickly subdued and cuffed. Patricia continued screaming about lawyers and conspiracies, but the officers pinned her to the wall, reading her rights. Marcus stared at them, heart pounding, a sense of vindication coursing through him. In the basement, they found a locked room with more forged documents, plus photographs of children, financial ledgers, and even specialized equipment for forging birth records. It was everything they needed to bury Alan and Patricia under a mountain of criminal charges. The hush that fell over the officers examining the evidence was grim. Each piece of paper, each photograph, was a testament to the suffering these criminals had inflicted on innocent children. Alan and Patricia were dragged out in cuffs, neighbors gathering on their porches to watch in shock. As the officers guided them to the waiting vehicles, Alan spat, "You can't stop this. We're just the small players." Marcus fixed him with a cold stare. "Small players or not, you're done," he said, slamming the car door. He saw Patricia's tear-streaked face, her voice shrill as she kept babbling about how Zoe was their daughter. There was no remorse, just fear of getting caught. Marcus felt only disgust. Simultaneous raids at other linked addresses yielded more leads, even the rescue of 2 more minors who'd been held in similar conditions. By the end of the night, the operation had gone off with remarkable success, the ring beginning to unravel. The next step would be to find every chain in their network, but at least the local cell was neutralized. Marcus returned to the station, exhausted, physically and emotionally. He felt half stunned and half exultant, thinking about the moment he would see Emma again, free from the fear that these monsters could reclaim her. When he arrived, Harriet opened the secured door to the protective area. Emma looked up from the cot where she'd been anxiously waiting. The moment she saw Marcus, she rushed toward him, flinging her arms around his waist. "Dad?" she asked in a tremulous voice, searching his face. "Are they gone?" Marcus knelt, folding her in an embrace. "They're in custody," he said, voice thick with emotion. "They can't hurt you anymore." She clung to him, relief flooding her small body, tears of release. Harriet wiped her own eyes, stepping aside to give them space. In that warm, tearful reunion, Marcus felt a lifetime's weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't over yet, of course. There would be court proceedings, public scrutiny, more arrests as the entire ring was exposed, and who knew what sort of challenges Emma would face as she tried to recover from her years away. But in that moment, they had found each other. A father and daughter, torn apart by cruelty, were finally reunited. A sense of profound gratitude and love coursed through him, mingled with the grief of so many lost days and birthdays and memories. He silently vowed to rebuild what they could, day by day, step by step. He looked into Emma's eyes, puffy from crying, but shining with a spark of hope. "We'll get through this," he whispered to her. She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder, trusting him in a way that made his heart ache. He didn't care how hard the road ahead might be. They were together now, and that was everything. He held her close, wanting nothing more than to protect her from all the evils of the world. That was how the first, largest portion of their journey ended, with Emma safe at last from Alan and Patricia, and the beginnings of justice for a vile conspiracy that had claimed so many children. Yet there was more to face, more revelations to come, and the slow process of healing for both Marcus and Emma. They would have to go to court, see the criminals tried, and unmask the depths of corruption that enabled such a ring to operate. Through it all, Marcus would stand by Emma's side, guided by a father's fierce love, determined to ensure no family would ever again be torn apart by these monsters. He woke early the next morning, heart pounding with the residue of his dreams. The sun had barely lifted over the horizon when he drove to the station, desperate to see Emma again and confirm that the nightmare of losing her all over hadn't become reality overnight. After everything that had happened, the arrests and the late-night raid, he worried that the criminals still lurking in the shadows might somehow rip her away from him once more. But when he turned the corner into the protective area and saw Emma, sleep-rumpled, hair tangled, wrapped in a blanket, he felt the strangest mixture of wonder and dread. This little girl, with her wary green eyes and quiet bearing, truly was his daughter. She had been stolen at barely 2 years of age, and now at 9, she felt like both a stranger and someone intimately close to his soul. He entered the room slowly, as though afraid to startle her. Emma looked up, and her face lit with recognition. There was uncertainty, even fear, but also a kind of hopefulness that reminded him of who she must have been before the trauma. A bright, fearless child who used to race into his arms. He approached, smiling gently. "Morning, kiddo," he said, his voice low. He didn't know if she'd want to hear him call her Emma or Zoe. After all, Zoe was the name she had used for so long, even if it was never truly hers. "Did you sleep okay?" She nodded shyly. I didn't have bad dreams this time." Her grip on the blanket tightened. "Are you leaving again?" "No," he said, pulling up a plastic chair to sit beside her cot. "I'll stay right here with you." He reached out and took her hand. She didn't pull away. "We're going to figure out all the next steps together, I promise." She gazed at him, eyes haunted by uncertainty. "So, what happens now?" He sighed, scrubbing a hand through his hair. "We have to go through some procedures. My colleagues, our lawyers, the court system. The people who hurt you, Alan and Patricia, they're in custody. They can't get near you." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "There might be a trial, a hearing. And we'll have to settle some things officially, so everyone knows you're Emma Reed, not Zoe. But it's okay. I'll handle it. You just need to rest and feel safe." She stared at the floor, picking at the edge of the blanket. "Am I going to have to talk in front of people? I'm scared to tell them what happened. They said no one would believe me." He felt a stabbing ache in his chest, hearing how effectively the criminals had manipulated her. "You only have to say as much as you're comfortable with," he whispered. "And we'll have professionals there to help, like child advocates who know how to handle this. If you're too scared to talk in a big courtroom, they'll find another way to get your story. Sometimes they'll have you talk privately and record it for the judge." He tucked her hair gently behind her ear. "Nobody's going to force you into a scary situation, okay? You have me, Harriet, Detective De Silva, all of us. We'll protect you." She clutched his hand. "You promise?" "On my life," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of every regret, every vow he'd ever made to a daughter he thought he would never see again. Laura De Silva appeared in the doorway behind them, clearing her throat softly. Her face softened at the sight of Emma, but her posture remained all business. "Marcus," she said, voice subdued, "when you get a second, we need to talk in your office about the next steps with the D. We made quite a few arrests last night, and the feds are all over this." He nodded. "Give me a minute." He squeezed Emma's hand once more. "I'll be right outside. Harriet will be here, okay?" Emma released his hand reluctantly, watching him go with apprehensive eyes. He followed Laura into the hallway. They wound through the corridor until they reached his small office. He shut the door behind them. Laura perched on the edge of his cluttered desk, crossing her arms. The ring is bigger than we thought. The men we took in last night are already threatening to name names higher up the chain if they aren't offered deals. Alan and Patricia are just one piece, as we suspected. Federal agents are pushing for more evidence. They want to unravel the entire network, from the forgers to the financiers. He rubbed a hand across his tired eyes. The bigger the net, the fewer children they can hurt. I'll do anything I can to help. I know you will, Laura said, but you realize that there's going to be a lot of attention on your daughter's case now. She's at the center of this. A kidnapped child who reappeared after 8 years, found right in the middle of one of these so-called private adoption placements. The media is going to latch on to that. The feds might want to move her somewhere safe, maybe a safe house, until the trial. He stiffened. I don't want her whisked away again. I just got her back. Laura nodded sympathetically. I know. But if they decide it's safer for her, we might not have a choice. Unless you can guarantee her protection yourself. That might mean stepping away from some parts of the case, focusing on her. The department isn't going to assign you to investigate your own daughter's kidnapping. It's a conflict of interest. He exhaled a shaky breath. Then so be it. She's my priority. I'll cooperate however they want, but I'm not losing her to some safe house without me there. I'll do whatever it takes to keep her in my custody. Laura's expression was kind but cautious. We'll do our best. For now, we're scheduling a preliminary hearing. A judge will review the evidence, formalize charges against Alan and Patricia, and ensure Emma is placed in your care, assuming we can prove definitively that she's your daughter. We have the DNA test, old photos, the timeline. He paused, jaw tightening. And Harriet, half the station have seen the resemblance. It's undeniable. We'll fight it out in court if we have to. Laura handed him a folder. You'll likely have to. Especially if the ring hires high-powered lawyers or tries to intimidate the D. There's talk that certain local officials might have been complicit. They might attempt legal maneuvers to sow doubt about the validity of the DNA test or claim that Emma, Zoe, is some other child. She pursed her lips. Don't underestimate them. They'll try any tactic to undermine your claim if it means avoiding heavier charges. He cracked his knuckles, feeling a flash of anger. Let them try. I'm ready. They parted ways. Marcus returned to Emma, found her in the corner of the lounge area with Harriet, who was sharing a packet of crayons and telling her silly jokes. He stood in the doorway a moment, chest tightening at the sight of Emma smiling. She looked so much like the little girl in his memories of better times. But she also looked older, haunted by experiences no child should have. He approached with a quiet laugh at Harriet's antics. You ready for breakfast? We've got some cereal, maybe fruit if we're lucky. Emma peered at him shyly. Yes, please. They all trooped to the station's break room, Harriet fussing to find some pastries or at least something better than stale cereal. Marcus poured Emma a carton of milk, handing her a spoon. It was a little thing, a normal morning routine, but he felt tears prick the corners of his eyes at how foreign it all seemed. He had missed 8 years of breakfasts with her. Emma glanced up. Daddy. The word tumbled out awkwardly, as though she was testing it, uncertain if it fit. He swallowed hard. Yeah. Do you think I can call you that? I don't really remember you as my daddy, but I want to. He forced back tears. Of course, he said, trying to steady his voice. I would love that. She nodded, blinking rapidly, then bent her head over her cereal. Harriet caught Marcus's gaze from across the table, her eyes glistening. He could tell Harriet wanted to say something comforting, but she seemed just as choked with emotion. As Emma ate, Harriet murmured, You'll be coming with me soon, sweetie. We have a special child advocate who wants to talk to you, ask about your memories. But it's nothing scary. You'll be in a safe room with me and maybe your dad too, if that makes you more comfortable. Emma's spoon clinked against the bowl. Will they ask about Alan and Patricia? Yes, Marcus answered carefully. They'll want to know what they did, how they treated you, who else you saw. It'll help us stop them from hurting any more kids. She went quiet for a while, then whispered, Okay. He felt a swell of pride and sorrow at her bravery, wanting nothing more than to shield her from the painful retelling. But justice required her testimony. At least they would do everything possible to make it gentle. The days turned into a whirlwind of legal motions, official statements, and preliminary hearings. The local district attorney, a stern woman named Gloria Park, oversaw the charges against Alan and Patricia: kidnapping, child endangerment, conspiracy to traffic minors, plus a host of fraud charges related to the forged adoption documents. Marcus was present at the first hearing, wearing his suit instead of his uniform, Emma seated beside him in a smaller chair, Harriet on her other side. They didn't make Emma speak in open court, only introduced her as the child in question. The hearing was primarily to decide whether bail would be granted and whether there was enough probable cause to move forward. Alan and Patricia were led in wearing rumpled clothes and sullen expressions. Patricia's hair was disheveled, no longer the carefully styled look she'd worn when she first appeared at the station. Alan glared daggers at Marcus, a silent promise of revenge. But the moment Emma noticed them, she shrank back, trembling. Marcus slipped an arm around her shoulders. It's okay, he whispered. They can't touch you. She nodded, tears in her eyes. When the judge asked how the defendants wished to plead, Alan's lawyer stood. Not guilty, he said firmly, weaving a tale about how Alan and Patricia had adopted Zoe through a legitimate agency, how Officer Marcus Reed was exploiting a situation because of his own personal tragedy, and how there was no proof Zoe was Emma Reed at all. The lawyer even hinted that the police might have tampered with the DNA test. Marcus's fists clenched under the table, knuckles going white. Emma let out a small whimper, tears sliding down her cheeks. Harriet leaned in to reassure her, but Marcus felt the tension humming in the back of his skull. He knew this was only the beginning. The defense would do anything to muddy the waters. Outside the courtroom, the press had gathered. They shouted questions, cameras flashing. Officer Reed, is it true you believe your daughter was kidnapped by this couple 8 years ago? Emma, do you remember anything about your real family? How deep does this adoption scam run? Marcus tried to shield Emma with his body, ignoring the microphones thrust at them. Harriet and Laura helped steer them to a secure exit. Emma clung to his arm, her face pale with anxiety. Later that day, in a calmer environment, he found himself pacing in one of the station's quieter hallways. Laura came up behind him, placing a hand on his shoulder. They're going to fight dirty, she said. But we have a mountain of evidence. The ledger, the statements from other rescued kids, the financial records. And Alan and Patricia are hardly model parents with those suspicious finances. He let out a long breath. I know. It just kills me to see them drag Emma into this, making her question her memories all over again. That's part of the process, Laura replied softly. But she's strong and she has you now. Focus on that. He nodded, though his nerves remained coiled tight. In the weeks that followed, the case ballooned into a full-blown scandal. Multiple arrests were made, implicating lawyers, officials, and social workers who had taken bribes or looked the other way. Emma's story became a kind of symbol for all the missing children who had vanished into these fake adoptions. Interview requests flooded the police department. Marcus tried to keep Emma sheltered from the media circus, setting her up with therapy sessions and a gentle schooling schedule inside the department's protective unit. She was still easily startled, prone to nightmares, but she seemed calmer each day, especially when he was around. One afternoon, she timidly asked if they could go outside for a walk. I haven't been free like that in a long time, she said. Harriet and the station's child advocate agreed, on the condition that Marcus escort her and that they remained on police grounds. He guided her around the station's perimeter, letting her feel the crisp air and the mild sunshine. She slipped her hand into his, looking around curiously at the line of parked patrol cars. "Is that your car?" she asked, pointing to one of the black and white cruisers. He smiled faintly. "It's one I use sometimes, yeah." Then he thought of something. "Actually, I have my own personal car over in the staff parking lot. It's not fancy, but maybe one day we can go for a drive somewhere quiet, just the two of us." She gazed up. "Really? Maybe to a park that isn't scary?" He squeezed her hand. "Absolutely. A nice park with playgrounds. We can bring lunch and a frisbee if you like." She nodded, and for the first time, he saw genuine excitement in her eyes. It warmed something deep in his chest, a flicker of normal father-daughter life that he hoped to reclaim. The court date arrived sooner than Marcus expected, an official trial set to address the charges against Alan and Patricia. A flurry of legal motion battles preceded it. Their lawyers challenged the DNA evidence again, tried to cast doubt on Marcus's motivations, and even claimed that Emma's memory was implanted or coached. But the prosecutors, led by Gloria Park, countered with the ledger, the forged adoption papers with suspiciously identical seals, and the testimonies of other rescued children who described similar living conditions under Alan and Patricia's associates. Marcus sat at the prosecution's table, suit jacket buttoned tightly, mind racing with dread and hope in equal measure. Emma was in a private witness room, ready to give her testimony via a closed-circuit feed to the court so she wouldn't have to face Alan and Patricia directly. Harriet was with her, as was a court-appointed therapist. He thought that was best, to spare her from the intimidation of seeing her kidnappers in person. Before her testimony, Marcus was called as a witness. He stood, hands clasped behind his back, trying to keep his voice steady. The prosecution asked him to recount the night he found Zoe in the park, how she was alone, freezing, terrified. He explained the inconsistencies in Alan and Patricia's stories, and how the DNA test revealed Zoe to be Emma Reed. The defense attorney then cross-examined him, implying that he'd used his position as a police officer to manipulate a random child into believing she was his lost daughter. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "That's absurd," he said, voice clipped but controlled. "I had a private lab perform the test to confirm what my instincts told me. I wasn't about to make a baseless claim, especially after 8 years of heartbreak. The results were conclusive." The defense attorney leaned forward. "Yet you don't have the original chain of custody for that DNA sample, do you? Isn't it possible you mishandled the evidence or mislabeled it?" "No," Marcus said tersely. "I oversaw it myself, and the lab is reputable, independent of any involvement with the police department. There was no mishandling or mislabeled sample." The lawyer tried a few more jabs, but Marcus stuck to the facts. Eventually, the defense gave up, probably hoping to score bigger points discrediting the ledger or the other victims' testimonies. Next came the moment he dreaded, Emma's testimony. He sat at the prosecution table, hands folded so tightly his knuckles were white. An overhead screen flickered on, revealing Emma in a smaller room, Harriet and the therapist quietly off to the side, out of the camera's view. Emma looked pale, dressed in a neat outfit Harriet had chosen, hair combed but still a little messy. She wrung her hands nervously. "Hello, Emma," Gloria Park said, her voice gentle. "You understand that you're here to tell the truth about what happened to you, right?" Emma nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you tell the court where you were living before Officer Reed found you?" Emma took a trembling breath. "I was living with Alan and Patricia. I thought my name was Zoe. They told me I was their daughter. But I never felt like I belonged." She glanced off-screen, maybe looking for Harriet's comforting presence. "I wasn't allowed to go outside a lot. They'd bring strange people over. Sometimes other kids, but they never stayed." Gloria's voice was calm, guiding. "Did Alan or Patricia ever threaten you?" Emma nodded, voice quavering. They told me not to talk about what went on in the house. If I did, they'd say I'd get hurt, or I'd be taken away to a worse place. I was really scared, so I never told anyone. Gloria continued gently, how did Alan and Patricia treat you on a daily basis? Emma swallowed hard. If I didn't do exactly what they wanted, they'd lock me in my room. Sometimes they yelled a lot, or took pictures of me with other kids. They said it was for adoption agencies, but it never felt right. Sometimes people came and looked at us, like we were for sale. Then, all of a sudden, the other kids would be gone. New ones would show up. She bowed her head, tears brimming. Marcus fought to keep his expression neutral, heartbreak ripping through him. Gloria paused for a moment, allowing Emma a breath. The defense counsel shifted in their seats, likely already planning how to discredit a 9-year-old. Marcus's jaw tensed. Emma, Gloria asked gently, when you first encountered Officer Reed, can you describe how you felt? Emma's eyes flicked to the camera, as if looking at Marcus. I was scared. I ran away from Alan and Patricia because they said they were going to move again, and I didn't want to go. I ended up in that park. It was so cold and I was crying. Her voice trembled more. Then he found me. Officer Reed was really kind and I felt, I don't know, safe for the first time in a long while. Gloria approached the final question carefully. Did you come to learn anything about who Officer Reed actually was, in relation to you? Emma sniffled, tears escaping down her cheeks. He's my dad. My real dad. When they told me and showed me pictures and the DNA test, I sort of remembered things like tiny flashes. I still don't remember everything, but I feel it in here. She pressed a hand to her chest. He's not lying. There was a silence in the courtroom. The judge's face showed compassion. Across the aisle, Alan and Patricia sat stone-faced, possibly instructed by their lawyer to not show emotion. But that only made them look cold and uncaring. Marcus felt an immense wave of pride in Emma's bravery. It took so much to speak on a camera like that. The defense attorney cleared his throat, leaning forward to question Emma. Zoe, he began, deliberately using that name. You said you were scared. Could it be that you imagined Officer Reed was your father because he was kind to you? Maybe you wanted a parent so badly that you believed him. Emma's brow furrowed. My name is Emma, she said, voice a bit stronger. No, I didn't imagine it. He showed me pictures from when I was a baby, and I recognized my old house in them. It's real. The lawyer tried another angle. Do you remember anything about being kidnapped at age 2? She frowned, tears slipping again. No, I was too little. But just because I don't remember doesn't mean it didn't happen. The attorney sighed in defeat. No more questions. Her testimony ended. Marcus could finally breathe. Emma's image vanished from the screen, replaced by the empty gray background of the camera feed. He longed to go to her, wrap her in a hug, tell her she had done so well. Instead, he had to remain at the prosecution table, watch the rest of the evidence unfold. The forensic experts testified about the fraudulent nature of the adoption papers. Financial experts connected offshore accounts to both Alan and Patricia, confirming the money flow from bigger nodes in the ring. Sylvia Rosewood's ledger, which had become a key piece of evidence, was introduced with testimony from her sister, Eloise. The entire narrative painted Alan and Patricia as integral cogs in a vast criminal machine. At one point, the prosecutor played an audio recording that had been recovered from a phone seized during the raid. The clipped voices were Alan's and another unidentified man, discussing deliveries and papers for the kids. The jury shifted in their seats, some shooting Alan and Patricia disgusted glances. Even the judge looked outraged. Finally, after days of painstaking arguments, the prosecution rested. The defense tried to deflect blame, implying that Alan and Patricia themselves were victims of a larger scheme, that they had no idea children were trafficked. It was unconvincing. With every passing hour, the noose tightened around the defendants' necks. Marcus watched them grow more agitated, especially Alan. He seemed on the verge of snapping. When the trial concluded, the jury took only a day to deliberate. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all major counts. The judge remanded them to custody, pending sentencing. Alan exploded in anger when the verdict was read, shouting, "You can't do this! We had a deal. We're just small players." Bailiffs restrained him. Patricia broke into sobs, though no one seemed particularly sympathetic. The ring was not fully dismantled. Federal agents would continue investigating, but these convictions struck a major blow. Afterward, Marcus slipped away from the throng of reporters to find Emma in the child witness room. She sat with Harriet, hugging that ragged teddy bear Harriet had given her. She looked exhausted, eyes ringed with dark circles. He crouched beside her, resting a hand on her back. "Hey," he said softly, "it's done. They can't hurt you anymore." She stared at him, her face etched with uncertainty. "So, what happens to me now? I know you're my dad, but we never got to live together before." Her voice trembled slightly. "What if I don't know how to be your kid?" He pulled her into a gentle embrace. "We'll figure it out together," he promised. "We can go slow. We'll do normal stuff, have breakfast at home, watch movies, play outside. We have time to figure out everything." A surge of emotion threatened to overwhelm him, but he held it in check. "I'm not going anywhere, Emma." She snuggled closer. "I'm glad," she whispered, and Harriet, standing nearby, discreetly turned away to wipe her tears. In the days that followed the verdict, the Department and Child Protective Services arranged for Emma's transition into Marcus's custody. There were forms to fill, psychological evaluations to ensure it was healthy for her. She was still legally considered a minor who had been missing for years, so the system wanted to be sure about every detail. But it helped that the DNA results were conclusive and that Marcus had a stable job and home. The courts granted him immediate guardianship while all the final paperwork on her identity got processed. He took Emma to his modest apartment on a cool spring afternoon. She carried a small backpack of belongings, mostly donated clothes and keepsakes Harriet had given her. She stood in the living room, gazing around at the sparse furniture, the boxes of old case files, and the single photo of Emma as a baby perched on a bookshelf. Marcus felt self-conscious that the place didn't look like a warm family home. He'd been living alone for years. But Emma walked over to the bookshelf, picked up the framed baby photo, and compared it to her reflection in a wall mirror. "That was me?" she asked, examining the picture. "I look different, but my eyes, they're the same." He smiled softly, swallowing a lump in his throat. "Yeah. You were about a year old. It was the day I got promoted to detective. You used to giggle whenever you saw my badge, like you thought it was a toy." She set the photo down carefully. "It's kind of cool to see how I looked back then." Her voice was tentative, as though she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be happy about it. He cleared his throat. "You can see more pictures if you want. I have an album somewhere, lots of them from when you were a baby." She nodded shyly. "That sounds nice." Later that evening, he cooked a simple dinner, pasta with Jared sauce and a salad. Emma hovered in the doorway of the small kitchen, picking at her fingernails. "Can I help?" He blinked. "Sure. Wanna chop the lettuce?" He handed her a duller knife, showing her how to slice carefully. She worked silently, occasionally peeking over at him with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and caution. He was struck by how foreign this must feel to her, helping a parent with dinner, trusting a grown-up to guide her without fear. They sat down at a small table in the living area, plates steaming. The first few bites were eaten in silence, both uncertain how to start. Finally, Emma cleared her throat. "So, do I have a bedroom?" "I guess that's something you need, right, if you live with your dad?" He swallowed a grin. "Of course you have a bedroom. It's not very decorated, though. It used to be my storage room. But I moved all the boxes out, put a bed in there, dresser, a nightstand. We can paint it whatever color you like, buy some new stuff to make it yours." Her eyes lit up a fraction. "Really?" "Yeah, absolutely. Any color you want. You can pick posters, blankets, everything." He paused, tapping his fork against the plate. We'll make it feel like home for you. She fiddled with the edge of her napkin, as though struggling with a question. Can I call it my room? He reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. Yes, Emma, it's your room, he said, voice breaking a little. This is your home now. She blinked back tears. Okay, she whispered. Despite the relief of her being with him, the aftermath of her trauma would not vanish overnight. She woke one night screaming, evidently from a nightmare about being locked up or taken away again. Marcus rushed into her bedroom, found her sitting upright in the tangled sheets, tears soaking her face. He sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. It's all right, he murmured, voice shaky with concern. You're safe. I promise. She cried into his chest, clinging to him until she exhausted herself and fell back into a fitful sleep. The next morning, she apologized over and over, as if embarrassed by her fear. He just held her close, insisting that she never had to apologize for nightmares or for feeling scared. Harriet visited often. She brought small gifts, clothes in Emma's size, stuffed animals, crayons and sketchpads. One afternoon, Harriet found Emma in the living room, quietly drawing pictures of a backyard she remembered, half imagined. Marcus peeked over her shoulder. That's our old backyard, isn't it? He asked softly, recognizing the shape of a large oak tree that used to stand behind the swing set. Emma nodded. I remember the swing. I remember you pushing me on it. She bit her lip, tears threatening. Did I have a mom too? He felt a pang. His ex-wife had moved away after the kidnapping, unable to cope with the grief. They had divorced. He said gently, Yes, you did, but things changed when you were taken. She doesn't live here anymore. I've tried calling her to let her know we found you. She said she wants to see you, but she lives across the country. It might take some time for us to figure all that out. We'll do it at your pace, whenever you're ready. She pressed her lips together. Okay. He ruffled her hair. One thing at a time, kiddo. Court sentencing day arrived for Alan and Patricia. Though the trial was over, the official sentencing would finalize how long they would spend behind bars. The courtroom was less crowded this time. No jury, only the judge, the attorneys, a handful of reporters, and some members of the public. Marcus brought Emma, not because she had to speak again, but because she insisted she wanted to see it through. She had Harriet on one side, her father on the other. She seemed calmer now, though she tensed when Alan and Patricia were escorted into the courtroom in prison jumpsuits, shackled at the wrists. When Patricia caught sight of Emma, her eyes widened. She opened her mouth as if about to speak, but the bailiffs cut her off, quietly warning that any outburst would be penalized. Alan looked gaunt, an expression of furious defeat on his face. The judge reviewed the charges, the guilty verdict, and the recommended sentences. Alan and Patricia each got multiple counts that stacked up to decades in prison without the possibility of parole for a good portion of that time. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Emma let out a quiet exhale and reached for Marcus's hand under the table. He squeezed it gently. Outside, reporters lingered. One approached Emma, a microphone extended. How does it feel to see the people who raised you go to jail? Are you relieved? Angry? Marcus stepped in front of her protectively. Back off. She's a child. No comment. He ushered Emma away to Harriet's car, ignoring the flurry of cameras. Harriet whisked Emma back to the station while Marcus dealt with the remaining reporters. Only after that did he drive home, head pounding with the aftermath of so many emotions. That night, Emma curled up on the couch beside him as they watched a cartoon movie. Halfway through, she fell asleep, her head on his shoulder. He smoothed her hair, heart swelling with love and sorrow at once. But at least it was over. The criminals who stole her life had been punished. They would never manipulate or threaten her again. The federal investigations continued to ripple outward, netting more arrests. Marcus provided statements regarding Emma's ordeal, ensuring that the ring's higher-ups would be exposed. Meanwhile, he devoted his attention to becoming a proper father again. He took Emma to buy paint for her room. She chose a soft lilac color that reminded him of the old spring flowers they used to have in their backyard. They spent a weekend painting, covered in splatters, laughing at each other's messy attempts. One evening, she asked if they could drive by their old house, just to see it. He hesitated, worried it might be too emotional, but she insisted. So they drove, the late afternoon sun casting a golden hue over the quiet suburban streets. He pulled up in front of the small brick home where they had once lived as a family. Another family occupied it now. The yard looked different. The swing set was gone, replaced by a newer one, and flower beds lined the walkway. Emma stared out the car window. "I remember the tree," she said. "It's bigger now, but I still remember how it looked before." He bit his lip, tears threatening. "I used to push you on the swing under that tree almost every day. You'd squeal with laughter." She watched the house in silence for a minute or two. Eventually she said, "I'm glad I got to see it." He nodded, turning the key to start the car. "Me too." They didn't linger. Sometimes the best way to reclaim memories was to see the tangible changes and then move forward again. A few months later, as winter transitioned into early spring, Marcus found himself thinking about the night he first stumbled upon her in that cold, lonely park. Now, the days were growing milder, the branches on the trees budding with new leaves. He approached Emma one morning after breakfast. "Hey," he said, "I was thinking, do you want to visit that park again? I know it might be weird, given what happened, but I thought we could walk through it and see that it's just a normal place in daylight, not something to be scared of." She looked thoughtful. "Yeah," she said slowly, "I think I want to do that. It's like where we met, right? Or re-met, I guess." He smiled. "Right. Let's go." They drove together to the park, Harriet tagging along at Emma's request. She said Harriet felt like an ant, always hovering with kindness. The moment they arrived, Emma hesitated, scanning the area. The bench where he'd first spotted her was still there, though the battered paint had been touched up. The barren trees that once rattled in winter's chill were covered in fresh green buds. Parents now pushed small kids on swings, joggers circled the walkway. The place seemed alive and welcoming. Emma walked over to the bench, rested a hand on the metal rail. "I was so scared that night," she murmured. "I thought I might freeze out here, or that someone else would find me and take me back to them." She turned to Marcus. "But then you showed up." He touched her shoulder. "Best decision I ever made was patrolling that route. Even if it was just luck, I'd like to think it was something more." She exhaled, the gentle breeze ruffling her hair. "I'm glad too. Now I'm not scared of this place anymore." He noticed Harriet wipe tears discreetly. It was a small, symbolic step, reclaiming the park from the terrifying memory. But it felt important. Emma gripped his hand. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm ready to go." He nodded, giving a last look around. "Let's get lunch." They wandered out, leaving behind the bench where their father-daughter bond had been unexpectedly reborn. Soon after, came the official reissuance of Emma's birth certificate, with her rightful name. Marcus took her to the courthouse in a simple ceremony of finalizing her identity documents. A clerk handed over a crisp new certificate that read Emma Lynn Reed, with Marcus listed as her father. As they walked out, Emma stared at the paper in her hands. This means I'm me again, right?" she said, sounding awed. "No more Zoe. No more weird documents." He smiled, standing beside her in the bright afternoon sun. "That's right. All official. You're Emma Reed, my daughter, forever." She nodded, hugging the document to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, eyes shining. Her first day at a local school followed a few weeks later. She was understandably anxious, having never attended a real school after her abduction. Marcus spoke at length with the principal and teachers, explaining her unique situation. They were supportive, offering a counselor and an individualized plan. On that first morning, he walked her up to the school's main doors. She wore a backpack Harriet had given her, shaped like a cartoon cat. "I'll be right here at 3 o'clock," he promised, heart pounding with worry. You can call me anytime if you feel scared. Okay? Emma looked at the building, kids streaming in, laughter and chatter filling the air. A flicker of fear passed over her face, but she nodded. I'll try. She took a deep breath, stepped through the doors, and disappeared into the crowd. Marcus stood there for a moment, stunned at how large and unknown the world could be for her. He prayed silently she would find friends, or at least kindness. By the end of the day, she emerged tired but not entirely unhappy, hugging a small stack of worksheets. She climbed into his car, sighing. It was noisy, she reported, but my teacher was nice. Some kids asked me where I was from, and I just said I moved here. I didn't want to explain the whole story. He nodded sympathetically. You don't have to unless you want to. Your story is personal. She relaxed a bit. Thanks. He smiled, pulling out of the parking lot. I'm proud of you. Summer rolled around eventually, and they settled into a new normal. There were still therapy sessions, still occasional nightmares, still moments where Emma would freeze up if she heard certain loud voices or if she saw a face in a crowd that reminded her of the past. But step by step, she grew more confident. She made a few friends at school, started showing interest in drawing and music. Marcus supported her any way he could, sometimes standing on the sidelines of the living room clapping as she taught herself to strum a second-hand guitar Harriet found at a thrift store. One late afternoon, they sat together on the balcony of his apartment, a modest outdoor space with 2 folding chairs. The sky was streaked with pink and orange. Emma gazed up at it while nibbling on a cookie Harriet had baked. Marcus sipped some coffee, letting the comfortable silence linger. Eventually, Emma broke it. Dad? She said, trying out the word again. She called him Dad more often now, which filled him with quiet joy every time. Sometimes I still feel scared that someone will show up and say I'm not really Emma, or that they'll take me away again. He set the coffee cup down, leaning forward. I get it, he said softly. But no one's taking you away. We have all the legal documents, the court rulings, everything. Even more importantly, everyone in the police force knows your story. Harriet, Laura, all of them would protect you in a heartbeat. And he paused, voice thick with emotion. I would fight anyone who tried to come near you. That's a promise. She looked up, eyes brimming with tears. Yeah. I believe you. He reached out and ruffled her hair. I'm not going to lie, there are bad people out there. But we have good people too. And you're safe with me. She nodded, tears glistening. I know. I just have to get used to it, I guess. They watched the sun sink lower, painting the sky in deeper hues. In that gentle hush, father and daughter leaned against each other, finding solace in the shared warmth of a bond that had been torn apart and miraculously sewn back together. A few weeks later, Harriet and Laura organized a small get-together at the park, ironically, the same one where Emma had first been found. But they chose a sunny weekend afternoon, inviting other officers, some friends from the station, and a few community members who had quietly supported the case. Picnic blankets dotted the grass, a grill smoked in the corner, children raced around with kites. The place no longer felt haunted by the memory of that cold winter's night. Emma clung to Marcus's side at first, overwhelmed by the crowd. But Harriet coaxed her gently to join a group of kids playing a game of catch. Marcus watched from a distance as Harriet tossed the ball underhand, Emma catching it with a laugh. She looked so much like a normal kid, shoulders relaxing in the warm sun. Laura sidled up to him. She's doing great, she observed with a proud grin. He nodded, heart swelling at the sight. Yeah, she is. He glanced at Laura. Thanks for everything. I know we say that a lot, but I wouldn't have gotten her back without your help. Laura shrugged. You'd have found a way. But I'm glad I was there. She shifted her gaze to the group of kids, lowered her voice. You know, if you ever need a babysitter, I'm open. She's a good kid. He smiled. I appreciate it. You'll probably get a call soon. My life is about to get busy. I'm going back to full duty next week. He'd taken a partial leave to focus on Emma, but the captain had finally convinced him to return. She's adjusting well, and I want her to see that normal life can continue. Laura raised an eyebrow. She'll be proud of you. I know it. Over by the kites, Emma spotted him watching. She waved, a big grin on her face. He waved back, feeling that same tightness in his chest, an odd mix of overwhelming love and the memory of all those lost years. But now, that ache was balanced by hope for the future. As the sun shone down, he realized how far they'd both come from the terror of those winter nights. They still carried scars, but they were healing. And with the criminal ring exposed in court, countless other children stood a chance of rescue, or at least the system had become more vigilant. There was still more work to do, but for today, in this safe moment under the bright blue sky, father and daughter could simply live. Toward the end of the picnic, Harriet came up, balancing a tray of lemonade cups. She smiled at Emma. "Hey kiddo, want some lemonade?" Emma nodded, taking a cup. She hesitated, then said, "Can we have a toast? Like, to something good?" Harriet blinked away tears. "Sure. What do you want to toast?" Emma cast a quick look at her dad, then lifted her cup. "To new beginnings, I guess." She looked around at the supportive faces, Marcus, Harriet, Laura, a handful of officers. To not being Zoe anymore. To being Emma. They all lifted their cups, echoing variations of, "To Emma." Marcus, heart swelling, tapped his cup gently against Emma's. As she sipped, eyes shining with quiet triumph, he thought of all the nights he'd prayed for a miracle, all the times he'd awakened from nightmares calling her name. She was safe in front of him, strong in her own right, ready to claim a new life after years of stolen identity. It was more than he'd dared hope for. When Emma set her cup down, she gave him a small, conspiratorial smile. "Hated. Think they have a swing set here?" He laughed, remembering the earlier memory she'd drawn. "Yeah, they do, over there by those trees." "Then let's go," she said, slipping her hand into his. "I want to swing again. You can push me." He let her lead him across the grass, Harriet and Laura hanging back with knowing smiles. His daughter's hand in his felt warm and alive, tethering him to the present. Together, they approached the swing set, a simple arrangement of metal beams and wooden seats. She settled onto one seat, gripping the chains, and he stood behind her, giving a gentle push. She kicked off, hair catching the breeze, face turned up to the sunlight. Each arc carried her higher, her laughter trailing behind like a joyful echo. He watched her, eyes misting, thinking that despite all the darkness they'd endured, a father's love and a child's resilience had somehow prevailed. As the swing soared, Emma glanced over her shoulder at him, that big smile still lighting her face. "Don't let go," she called, half laughing, half breathless. He grinned wide, heart full, memories of a different time merging with this one. "Never," he replied, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. He gave the swing another push, anchoring himself firmly to the earth so she could reach toward the sky. And in that moment, sun on their faces, fresh grass underfoot, the sound of carefree children playing around them, they both knew that this was their life now, their new beginning, stitched together from fragments of love and unbreakable resolve. No more stolen years, no more living in fear. Just a father and daughter, free at last, forging a future brimming with hope.